Hi, and welcome back to Map the Maze on what is a truly rainy day. I don't know if that comes out in the picture. I talked last time about hatred and how it can impact people in mediation and in negotiation. And today I thought I would talk about depression because I think it's another aspect which can really impact mediation and negotiation. How does depression impact people in mediation? Generally, what I have seen is that it slows people down, it impairs their ability to make decisions, and it makes it very difficult, I think, for the other person in the mediation to understand what is happening in terms of the process. Let me talk a little bit about that in context. When I say depression, I don't mean people who are sad, people who are upset. This is beyond that. This is somebody who has been clinically diagnosed with depression according to the DSM-5. We're talking about an actual clinical depression. And one thing I was reading this week, which I thought was really interesting, is some research that's been done by and published in the Cambridge University Press by some scientists about the impact of depression. And what they've said is that it impacts reward making, reward wanting in various ways. The first one is that there is an inability to use information to determine cost benefit, to determine the magnitude of risks, and also to determine the probability of reward. And straight away you can see how that would strongly impact somebody in mediation. That if you can't use information, data, which is what we're trying to help people do, make informed decisions about risk, reward, cost, benefit. If you can't use that information, or using that information, that ability is impaired because you are clinically depressed, it is really going to impair your ability to function in the mediation. So you won't be able to process the data that comes in. For example, financial information, financial disclosure will be really difficult to access. And having seen that in mediation, this research study really impacted me because I have seen people who are really intelligent but just cannot process the information. Also, what this study talks about is the inability to look at the costs and the benefits, to actually weigh up the different options that are being considered. And that, again, completely consonant with the experience that I've had in mediation of people who are depressed. They maybe haven't gone and been diagnosed, but their behavior suggests that they are depressed. And I think what's really key for people who are in mediation, because the alternative to this is going to court. And so therefore understanding the risks, the magnitude of those risks, and the probability of winning is incredibly critical to deciding whether you want to try and find an amicable solution in mediation, or whether you want to go to court, whether it makes sense to go to court, especially given the costs of everything. There's another video on that. But that was a real concern for me, because that ability to decide, should I stay at the table and keep negotiating, or should I take my chances in a courtroom, will be strongly impacted by this ability to not be able to weigh up the magnitude of the risk or the probability of winning. And the last one that they talk about, which is so true given the experience that I've had with people who are depressed, is a lack of motivation. It is just a complete lack of ability to get the energy to move through the process. All of these things, the lack of ability to use data, the lack of ability to assess cost benefit, risk, the possibility of reward, the magnitude of risk, the lack of motivation, all of that contributes to this inability to make decisions. And it's a real problem in mediation, because one of the challenges is the whole process is predicated on the basis that people can make decisions in their own best interest. This is the mantra, that people have the ability, have the capacity to make decisions in their own best interests, and that this is the platform to do that. If you are impaired in the sense that you are depressed, clinically depressed, and now you cannot do all of these things, it makes it impossible for the mediation process to advance. And I think one of the real challenges is people often don't realize that they are depressed, so they may not have sought help, they may not have sought mental health support, they may be being treated by a mental health professional, but maybe none of this happens overnight. And that whilst this is happening and whilst this is playing out potentially in the mediation, the other person who isn't depressed is struggling to understand what is going on. Why is this taking so long? Why is the other person, who they know well, so they know that this person is intelligent, they know this person can process information, why suddenly are they incapable of processing information, making a decision, moving forward, actually participating in the mediation? And I think it can lead to an incredible level of frustration. And also then obviously, all of us, why is this going on? And I think if the answer isn't obvious, or perhaps they haven't read about the impact of depression on people, it can become very quickly a negative. It can be seen as a strategy. Oh, this is their strategy to try and get more out of me. This is their strategy to drive me crazy. This is their strategy to keep this going for as long as possible. And that may be true, I don't know. The reality is we can't open people's heads up and find the answers. At least, pretty sure we can't. I haven't been able to. That's the challenge. That on one side you have somebody who is impaired because of a clinical depression and therefore is struggling to process anything and move through anything and to, at the end of the day, make decisions, which is what mediation is all about. And on the other side, you have a person who maybe is distanced from the other person, so doesn't see them every day, doesn't know how they're doing, and only sees the lack of processing, the inability to produce information, the inability to review the data, the inability to get legal advice, the inability to respond to proposals, an inability to actually make a final decision, maybe even an inability to really decide if they want to stick with the mediation or if they want to try and go to court. And all of that can lead to an incredible level of frustration on the other side and a lack of goodwill. So when I think back to some of the cases where maybe there hasn't been a diagnosis of depression, but I think possibly that is what has been going on. And obviously I'm not in a position to diagnose anybody, but certainly this person had characteristics which would suggest that they were depressed. That level of inability to move forward has led to whatever goodwill was on the other side being squandered. And it can be very frustrating when you're sitting in the mediation and you can see one person is deciding, let's be amicable, let's try and get this done. The other person says, yes, let's be amicable, let's get it done, but then doesn't process, doesn't move forward. And the goodwill that this other person who's ready to move forward and wants to do amicably has can evaporate overnight. And that's a real challenge. I guess what I would say is, if you think you may be depressed, or if you're concerned that you have some issues with all of the joy, all of the light has been sucked out of life, and maybe it's because of what's happened, and maybe there's a whole range of factors that are impacting you, please go and get some mental health support. It is so important. And none of this is, I need to tough it out. This is not toughing it out territory. Yeah, this is, I actually need to get some help. And maybe you go and they're like, no, actually, you're fine. Here's 10 things to do, and you do them and you're okay. Maybe they say, no, actually, you are clinically depressed and we need to be working with that in a range of different ways. Because what I would say is the impact on the negotiation, if we look at that as its own kind of being, is colossal. And from my perspective, can be unnecessarily stressful. If you are concerned that this could be you, please go and get mental health support. If you're in the mediation and you think this could be the other person, this is an alternative to the Machiavellian strategic, I'm dragging my feet. I am deliberately behaving in a way to draw this process out, which you might want to think about. And if you are concerned, then maybe this is something to mention to the mediator, to see if they can raise it with the other party. Not that everybody in divorce has a mental health issue, but often these things happen simultaneously or are coexisting. And so recognizing that you might have some challenges and dealing with them is far better than trying to pretend that you don't have challenges and trying to ignore them. Because the reality is, if you are clinically depressed, this recent study is going to suggest that all of these faculties, all of this analysis that you need to be able to do is going to be severely impaired, and you're not going to be able to do it. And what I would say is, it is much better to try and deal with that situation, get the help to be able to function in the mediation in a way that is effective, in a way that is constructive, as opposed to thinking, I will tough it out and just go anyway, see what happens, and potentially lose goodwill from the other side to try and get things done amicably. Again, another plea, get some mental health support. It couldn't be more valuable in terms of making sure that you can function at your best. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Take care.